This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Ichi-F and Platinum End. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys who are highly educated and love to talk about manga. And on this month's manga episode, Shea and I are going to be looking at two recent publications. We're going to begin with Ichi-F, a worker's graphic memoir of the Fukushima Nuclear Power Plant by Kazuto Tatsuta. And then after that, we're going to look at the first two volumes of Tsugumi Oba and Takeshi Obata's Platinum End. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but many times you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
Like this month, you can get the fantastic, massive Gay Manga and the Men Who Make It for 30% off. And you can get volumes of Bakuman by the same creative team as a book we're going to talk about today for 30% off as well.
That's right. You know, whether you tend to prefer manga or Western comics, it doesn't matter because they have all of it at great discounts at Discount Comic Book Service. So definitely check out their website, and that is dcbservice.com. You got to go there. You must. It is a prerequisite for listening to this podcast. For all of your comics and manga pre-ordering needs, and after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. So, Shea, here we are. This is the second time you and I are recording in the month of March because if our listeners remember, we were a little late by 2 or 3 days in getting the February show out. But as promised, here we are with the March show before the end of March.
That's right. And we hope that a double dose of the manga episode is welcomed and not. And, yeah, we want people to be excited to get us twice a month.
Yeah. Think of, 2 doses of the manga series a month as kind of a soothing balm to your daily lives. In fact, I wanted the podcast to be known from now on as a soothing balm for listeners. But seriously, we were talking about last episode of the manga series, and if you remember, on that one, we discussed Revolutionary Girl, Utena, and Ghost in the Shell Deluxe. And we got a response from one of our listeners to that episode. And in fact, this response came not through email, but via YouTube. For those of our listeners who do not know, the Comics Alternative has a YouTube channel, and for the past almost 2 years now, I think it is, I've been making available all of our episodes as static YouTube videos. And so in terms of the audio, it's the exact same thing as you get with the podcast. It's just that it's in YouTube format, and it is a static image on the video. And I did that because there are some people who like to consume their media of a variety of kinds through YouTube over other things like podcasts. And so we don't get near as many listens on YouTube as we do with the podcast and downloads, of course. But one of the things I've noticed over the past several months, Shea, is that of our YouTube videos on the channel, the ones that are by far the most popular in terms of numbers of views is the manga episodes.
Mhm.
And we actually did have a response for, what we did last month, where we looked at Revolutionary Girl, Utena, and Ghost in the Shell. And the person who wrote us, and he said we could share his message, is Osiris Adriano. And he says, guys, here are some clarifications about Utena and manga adaptation of anime series. Usually when an original anime, not based on manga or novels like almost 90% of the animes are based on, is in production, a manga series is created in order to give the series some kind of promotion. Needless to say that most of these manga series are disposable pieces of crap, but in some cases, a little few actually are marketed to be more than promotional material. This manga, I guess Revolutionary Girl Utena, is one of those examples, and the Neon Genesis Evangelion as well that you mentioned in your podcast, and I think you mentioned that, Shea. Mm-hmm. And then he also responds about Papas, which we mentioned a few times, part of the creative team of Revolutionary Girl Utena. They are some kind of creative group that were more involved with the creation of the anime series. And then he gives a list of the people involved in that. He also makes a couple of other comments, I guess answering questions or making statements that we addressed on that episode. He says the link between Utena and Sailor Moon is that the director Kunihiko Ukihara worked as director for the series. And then another point he makes is, I'm more of a reader of manga than Western comic books, but like to listen to the opinions of people who don't read a lot of manga. Great channel, and keep up the great work. So, Osiris, thank you very much for the comments. And I know that I am not by far an expert on manga. Shea is much more than I am. And so I'm sure that that's who Osiris was referring to, someone who doesn't read a lot of manga, someone who has a background in more of the Western comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always enjoy hearing from people. But that did remind me that I meant to talk to you about follow up on one of the things we talked about last episode with Utena is we mentioned a lot of the anime adaptations and the discrepancies between them. Mm-hmm. I actually got the chance to watch the Adolescence of Utena film pretty shortly after we recorded the episode, and I emailed you about it kind of breathlessly, and and I wanted to share with our listeners just how insanely bizarre and strange that movie is. It's not at all like anything we described on the last episode. It's a 90-minute movie. The last 30 minutes is a chase sequence where a lot of the characters transform into cars and motorcycles and crash into each other. It's very strange. It's very weird. But it's also really good, and I suggest people go watch it.
Okay, well, Shea, why don't we jump into the titles that we're going to be discussing this month?
All right.
And we're going to begin with Kazuto Tatsuta's Ichi-F, a worker's graphic memoir of the Fukushima Nuclear Power Plant. This came out early this month in March from Kodansha. And the author, his name, Kazuto Tatsuta, that is a pen name, correct?
Yeah, that is the impression that I got as well.
Okay. And in fact, at one point, I think it's fairly early in the memoir, he explains that he gets his name from one of the regions that was affected by the nuclear power plant disaster. Mm-hmm. And for our listeners who, I guess, have had their heads buried in the sand for the past several years, the Fukushima nuclear power disaster that was the result of an earthquake and a tsunami took place on March 11th in 2011. Mm-hmm. And so this is a memoir of one man's work at the plant. And one of the things that Tatsuta does is he takes us through the process of what it's like working there. He describes the facilities, and he also gives us more personal information about, I guess, his recollections or his experiences, right? Not just the objective facts. And there are a lot of those throughout this memoir. But, at times, I guess the memoir in places goes back and forth between kind of detached, objective reportage and then more subjective memoir writing where he tells us about what things mean to him or his experiences with some of the workers or the first time he remembers, such and such. So there's a lot of information packed in this book, and it is quite a big book. It is over 550 pages. And we should mention that this is an example of manga that reads in the traditional Western left-to-right manner.
Yeah, that was one thing that I noticed, immediately about the book. And I was curious to know why, or I would be curious to know why Kodansha made that choice in releasing it, because most of the work they release tends to be the traditional right-to-left format. So it is odd that they flipped it like that. And I'd be interested to know why they made that decision. But
yeah, I would too. I was thinking that maybe the reason that they did that is that this title, more than probably most of the others coming out from Kodansha, is going to appeal or potentially appeal to Western readers. And so that's why I think they flipped it to a left to right reading format. Because if you remember, we had the same thing with the Attack on Titan anthology, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it kind of gets back to how you started describing the book. That I was curious, or I would be curious to see how American readers how they find the book, because like you mentioned that. If the listeners are maybe haven't been paying attention, but I think it's more understandable for an American reader to not be as aware of the Fukushima disaster because it hasn't really been this constant in the news the way it has, or from what I understand about the way it's been kind of covered in Japan pretty continuously, and in a lot more depth and with a lot more focus in the Japanese news media. So I would be interested to see how American readers find this when it is a subject that was kind of it was a major deal when it happened and shortly thereafter. But 6 years later, it's kind of faded out of the public consciousness, or it seemed to, at least the American public consciousness. So I'd be interested to see how readers who they're not as close to the subject matter as maybe Japanese readers are find a book like this that is so. It relies so heavily on kind of repudiating the way it's covered in the news media.
Well, let's talk a bit about that. What you just mentioned about Tatsuta and the things he says at times where he directly addresses the rumors or the way that the general population of Japan tends to think of Fukushima, or the kind of news coverage that it's gotten, since 2011. What did you think of his, if we want to call it this, his pushback?
That's interesting. I think it's really related to the overall kind of style and tone of the book, which, and we can get into this in more depth later, but didn't totally work for me. But I think is a kind of didactic text that serves to educate people about what life is really like for the people cleaning this up and what the area is really like. I really appreciated those moments where he did take the time to mention how the area and how the disaster and the cleanup and the people involved with the cleanup are typically represented in the news media or talked about in the media, and to kind of push back on that. But at the same time, I got the sense that because I wasn't consuming these kinds of rumors or this information that he was pushing back on. I don't know if I was really able to fully appreciate how maybe revelatory or surprising a lot of the stuff he talks about was, because I didn't have this preconceived notion of what that the area is like, or what that process is like, that maybe a lot of his Japanese readers did. How did you find those kind of moments of pushback, like you said?
I found them useful, at least as much as I can tell. And I say that because I really don't know much of anything about the context of how Fukushima and everything surrounding it has been reported in the media, how the culture basically gauges the disaster, and his attempts to kind of clear the air to say, this is what a lot of people think. However, this is the way it actually is. Or, when they were in town, he and his friends could sense that, certain people or certain communities tended to look at them as, so to speak, or even literally contaminated, but we weren't at all. And it's just their ignorance that led them to make those assumptions. So I don't know how much of this kind of clarification is actually needed, or if he may be perhaps, and I'm not accusing him of this. I'm just wondering if he is not necessarily setting up a straw man, but he's making it seem as if the media and culture see Fukushima one way, but he is coming in almost like a crusading reporter. That's a little too dramatic, I think. But he's coming in as a more objective observer to set the record straight. Now, I don't think that there's anything really crusading going on here in Ichi-F, and I think that's to the book's benefit. Informative, definitely. You mentioned the word didactic, and I think to some degree that does define what's going on here in Ichi-F. But I don't think that it's kind of a heavy-handed didacticism. It's more, at least in the places where we get this, kind of a detached, objective statement of what things are like, a description of the grounds or of the camaraderie there, or some of the problems that the men face in working together on in such a close way on a site like this. So those kind of facts. To me, the book really became more interesting when we got to see the inside, so to speak, of the author, right? So when this became less reportage and more of a memoir, that's where I thought Ichi-F had its strongest moments.
Yeah, a couple of things you mentioned about it not being really clear if he was setting up this straw man. It does have me wondering whether or not, because it does rely so heavily on this kind of like very specific kind of cultural context. Even the kind of nature of the Fukushima disaster really plays into the Japanese imaginary and its relationship with nuclear power, which is much more complicated and very, very different from, our relationship with nuclear power and nuclear bomb and atomic energy. It does have me wondering whether or not something that is so kind of culturally specific can really translate to an audience that doesn't have the framework to really pick up on these certain elements that really make the drama, or I'm curious. Again, it really comes back to I'm interested to see how other Americans find this work, because it is so. It's not something that could exist outside of Japan. I mean,
yeah. I just feel that I don't have enough knowledge of the cultural textures, let's say, to the events surrounding this and the media attention on Fukushima. And I don't want to make it seem in my earlier statement, in saying that, I wonder if Tatsuta is maybe perhaps setting up a straw man. I don't want to suggest that he has a particular agenda that is insincere by any means whatsoever. whatsoever. And again, because I'm not in the culture and I don't have firsthand knowledge of this, I can't speak to that. But there are places, especially toward the beginning, I remember thinking, where he seemed to be actively attempting to set the record straight. And so I wondered, what was the context surrounding the original writing of Ichi-F? And I see in the back of the book that this comic or this manga was originally published between 2014 and 2015 in 3 different volumes. And so I'm wondering who published this and if there was what kind of corporate backing, if anything. And again, I'm not accusing there being any kind of ties here between, the author, his potential agenda, if there is any, and things surrounding Fukushima in Japanese culture. But I mean, I don't know. I don't think that you necessarily need to have all that information. And I do feel that I maybe had too many questions as I was reading this. But if you want to find out from what I can sense, what was happening, what was going on, and the ins and outs of how Japan was dealing with the Fukushima disaster, then I think that this would be a great introduction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with the latter. I think it is very, it's very, very informative. It's very in depth on a lot of things that I had. There were things that I both had no clue about and wouldn't have. There were answers to questions I would never have even thought to ask. But to your former point, I agree that it's, even talking about it now is, when we talk about books on the show, I like to obviously read them and then try and learn a little bit more about kind of history, the publication history, and other works by the author. But that was very, very difficult with this book in particular. I did a couple of Google searches for the book and for Tatsuta, and I was really unable to find anything about the book. So this is one where I am coming in cold, and it makes it difficult to talk about certain aspects of it. Like you said, you don't really know what its publication history is. Which makes it difficult to kind of even speculate at how it may have been received or intended in its original context.
Mm-hmm. And, you raise a good point that when you were doing your search, you couldn't really find that much, at least compared to searches for other mangaka. And we did mention that Tatsuta is a pen name. So even if he is someone who has written other things under a different name, that'd be difficult to find, or at least, I haven't seen that yet. And if our listeners know anything about this, please get in touch with us and let us know. But, I got the impression that in reading this, that this may be a first work of his, or in other words, at least he's not a seasoned mangaka like some of the creators, probably most of the creators that we discuss on this show. And that may lead me to state those quandaries that I had, right? Wondering, does he have an agenda? Is he being a little too dramatic in terms of wanting to set the record straight or what have you? And maybe it's nothing more than Tetsuta is a relatively young or, let's say, unpublished, inexperienced, if we want to put it that way, creator. And it's this kind of innocence that he brings to his narrative and the reportage that has me kind of scratching my head a little bit, but not scratching my head in a bad way, right? Just kind of wondering, okay, so who is this guy and what is going on and what is his relationship to the company or this potential, the original publisher? And I think the original publisher was Kodansha, right?
That would be my guess.
Because I'm looking in the back of the book, and it does say publication rights for English edition arranged through Kodansha Limited Tokyo, and that the first Japanese volumes did come out through Kodansha. So yeah, there's that. But I would be interested to know if the pen name guy Tetsuta has written anything else.
Yeah, I know they mention several times in the book that when he began this, he was a kind of amateur mangaka. So yeah, I'd be curious to see if he's done other things, or or what. And I actually, while I found the work kind of amateurish, at least his cartooning, there were a number of moments that I thought his acting and his cartooning was really bold and dramatic. And so this is a cartoonist I'd be curious to see future works from. I'd be curious to see how he kind of develops.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I'd like to see. I'd like to know more about this author.
Yeah. Well, okay. Can you give me one or two examples of those moments that seem to impress you more than others in this memoir?
Yeah, I think his close-ups, not one in particular, but throughout the book there are, a number of close-ups that his line work is just it's a lot. It just looks a lot more professional and kind of composed. His eyebrows are much more dramatic, whereas a lot of the work throughout the book in the kind of mid shots or longer shots it just feels kind of like sloppier. It's not as striking. It's much flatter in a way that a lot of the close-ups he does. He has a knack for capturing striking facial expressions in a way that really comes through in those close-ups.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you mentioned that it was originally published as 3 individual volumes. And I think that's clear from every so often you get these color pages, which to me kind of before I even knew it was originally published as 3 signaled to me that this was originally published as, the beginning of a separate volume. And I think his color work in those pages, or possibly an assistant, I have no idea. But the color work in those pages is really striking as well. So there were a number of panels and pages throughout the book that I thought were really striking more than anything else. But yeah, like I said, I think the bulk of his work it's just not as dynamic as those bolder kind of close-ups. And I would have liked to have seen more I would have liked to see more of those like really dramatic, really powerful facial expressions that I got in those close-ups. I think chapter 2 is the first one that really caught my eye, where I think it's an image of him kind of grabbing. He's like trying to itch his face with the face mask on.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I thought that was the way he draws his eyes and the way he draws his eyebrows in particular. I thought was really it was like I said, I keep coming back to the word striking, but that is that's the descriptor I think most apt for a lot of those. It just kind of hits you, and it's bold and it's dramatic and it looks good in a way that I really enjoyed.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you mentioned the very first page of chapter 2, where there is this close up on his face and he's trying to scratch his nose and he has that expression. And, this chapter is called Itchy Nose. This is one of those examples that I was referring to earlier, where we get, I guess, the more memoir as opposed to the more journalistic side of this narrative, because here is where he is telling us just a little bit of information, something that's maybe not idiosyncratic to him, but it's something very personal, right? In other words, not only did he experience this, but others who work there probably did the same. And that is, once he gets that mask on, if he itches on his face, then he's screwed, because he tells us right before this chapter how long it takes for them to, so to speak, seal themselves up, especially the mask, in order to, keep out the radiation. And it's not as if he can momentarily flip off the mask, scratch his nose, and then put it back on. So he has to live with that itch, and how infuriating can that be? So, I mean, yes, it's not the kind of objective reporting where he's telling us about, how an exploded tower may look, or what it may mean to the men who work there when a facility crumbles and a number of them were out of work. I mean, this is something very personal, but you can definitely relate to it, and so it's that relatability, I think, the personal subjective touch that really stands out in terms of the storytelling.
Yeah, I think for me overall, it was a fairly passive reading experience that I didn't dislike. It just, left me kind of cold in a way that a lot of memoir and a lot of autobio does.
Mm-hmm.
It's why I don't really find myself gravitating towards the genre, because it's a very passive experience that I don't, after I'm done with an autobiographical or a memoir text, I don't find myself really thinking too much about it afterwards. It doesn't stay with me the way some other kinds of genres do. But like you, I did find that those very personal moments where he kind of got away from the informational and more towards the personal were the book's strongest moments.
Yeah. Now, I'm more. I mean, I'm someone who does like autobiography and memoir, especially if it's done really, really well. And so I think this book resonated more with me than it did for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
We were talking about the kind of information that this book provides at the end of, I guess, the 3 sections, what the original 3 Japanese volumes were. We get translator notes, which are very useful. One of the things that Tatsuta does throughout the text is underneath the panels, or sometimes even slightly inside the panels, is he will give some kind of context, describe something, like what's going on or what the sign is saying, a sign that's in Japanese. And many times there will be an image of a hand pointing to something, and that hand is either right outside or on the border of a panel, and it's alerting us to what the note that accompanies it refers to. And I found, at first I wondered if I could find this irritating throughout the book, but I didn't. Once I got used to it, I found it quite useful. But in addition to that, there are translator notes at the end of the 3 different sections. And the translator notes, I'm assuming, are by Tatsuta, because according to the copyright page, he also owns the translation copyright. So I guess he's the translator of his own work into English.
Well, that is interesting.
Yeah. And then another useful portion of this book is at the very end, there is an interview with Tetsuo conducted by someone at Kodansha, because the back and forth is between Tatsuta and Kodansha Comics. So, and it's not a long interview. It's about, 5-6 pages long. But, it's nice.
Yeah, I always appreciate a lot, especially like we mentioned, it's a very culturally specific book, and like you mentioned, it is full of kind of language and phrases and terms that American readers may not be familiar with, because they're untranslated or they're difficult to translate. So I always appreciate when a book provides those detailed translation notes and like back matter and conversations with the author. It's often one of the things I really enjoy and remember fondly from reading, like Tankobon from when I was, 10 or 11. I would get, volumes of like Shaman King or Dragon Ball, and every 30 pages would be some like neat little back matter thing and like supplemental material. So I always love when manga includes those contextualizing elements and those little extras and stuff like that.
Well, Shea, you want to move on to the next title that we're discussing for this month?
Yeah, let's move on to Platinum End.
Yes, and this is written by Tsugumi Oba and Takashi Obata. This is the same creative team who brought us both Death Note and Bakuman. Now, have you read Death Note?
I have not read Death Note, but as luck would have it, I started watching the Death Note anime last night. So I am kind of familiar with the story a little, but I haven't actually read the manga. Did
you start watching the anime knowing that the next day we were going to be discussing Platinum End?
I mean, I definitely knew that we would be doing that, but I started it last night because my fiance Nicole is a is apparently a big fan of the anime, and she kind of pushed me into watching it last night. So I watched a few episodes.
Now, I have read the first 5 volumes of Death Note, and that's a 12-volume series, at least in English. And I need to finish it up. I actually, at this point, because it's been several years since I first started it, I need to go back and reread the first 5 volumes. But I really liked what I read, but I have not yet read Bakuman, and that is in 20 volumes. Have you read that?
I have not, but like Death Note, it's I've been aware of kind of Obata for a while, who illustrates all 3 of these series, and he's a really, really phenomenal cartoonist. And we can talk about his work on Platinum End here in a minute. But so I've been meaning to get to both Bakuman and Death Note for quite a while, because I'm pretty enamored with the way Obata draws.
And we should mention to our listeners that if they're interested in learning more about what we've just been discussing, Oba and Obata, their works, not only Platinum End, but Death Note and Bakuman, that Viz Media has box sets of both Death Note and Bakuman. Actually, we got my son the 12-volume box set of Death Note years ago, and so I have that. And as much as I would like to get the box set of Bakuman, it's a little pricey. I don't know. I'm holding out because I'm wondering if Viz will do with this series what it does with some of his series, combining, let's say, maybe 2 volumes into one longer book, right? So I don't have to buy this really big 20-volume box set.
I know Death Note, I think they're a couple volumes in now. They're doing that, and they're nice hardcovers, and I think all of the exterior of the pages is black. So when you pull it off the shelf, all the pages appear black. They're pretty nice looking volumes, at least for Death Note. So maybe we can, when they get a couple more of those out, maybe we can talk about that on the show. But yeah, I'd like to see them do that, something like that as well for Bakuman, to make it a little bit more affordable to pick up that slightly lengthier series.
Right. Now, getting back to the matter at hand, Platinum End. So far, 2 volumes of that have been released through Viz Media. Volume 1 came out in October of last year, and the second volume, the very beginning of March. And the third volume of Platinum End, I was looking this up, is due out in August. So they're not doing with Platinum End what sometimes Viz does with a number of their other series, and that is release them maybe about every other month or every third month. So it's not being published as frequently. But then again, Platinum End is currently ongoing. This actually began as a series in November of 2015, I think, and it's appearing in the Japanese magazine Jump SQ. Yeah, so maybe that's why we don't see more volumes more frequently.
That would be my guess as well. But there are, 5 volumes out. It might be because Jump Square is monthly. Yeah, it looks like it's monthly. So it's possible that they're putting a lot more lead time between it because, the installments, they only get 12 a year. So
they're pacing themselves.
Yeah, that would be my guess as well, is because it's ongoing, but also because, it's not like they have a full volume's worth every, 12 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so let's set up the premise of Platinum End, because I don't know about you, but when I first started Volume 1, I wondered, is this going to be too hokey for me to enjoy? And it turned out not to be. I became, by the end of the first volume, engaged in it to where I eagerly anticipated the second volume. So how would you describe the setup here?
Yeah, this is actually one of the, we sometimes get books on the show that are very difficult to kind of summarize briefly, but this is, it's pretty straightforward. It's about I think he's just starting high school, this young guy named Mirai Kakahashi, who has been abused by his aunt and uncle, and he tries to commit suicide, only to be saved by an angel who tells him that he is one of 13 people competing to become God.
Yeah, it sounds strange. Hirai is, an orphan, and you mentioned living with his aunt and uncle. He doesn't have a very good life. When we first meet him, it is soon before he enters high school. He's abused and taken advantage of at home. He's not really respected. He doesn't fit in at school. And so at the very beginning, within the first 2 or 3 pages, we see Hirai coming home from school, walking up to the top of, I guess, the apartment building where he lives with his aunt and uncle and cousins, and he jumps off because he has nothing anymore to make him happy. And happiness becomes a key concept in this series. That's why I mentioned it. So he jumps off, and as he's falling to what he thinks is going to be his imminent death, all of a sudden things go white, and he wonders, is this what death is like? But actually, that kind of blankness that he experiences is from being saved by an angel. So he literally has a guardian angel, and she introduces herself as Nase. Or is that how you pronounce the name? Nase, Nasse.
I think it's Nase.
Nase.
But with a lot of these names, I'm just going with phonetics.
Okay. So yeah, he is saved by his guardian angel, and she gives him a little background saying that, a lot of people have guardian angels, or some people have guardian angels. You do, and I've been watching over you. I can't let you die because you are, and I don't know if she uses this word, but it's something like this, one of the chosen. But we don't know yet why he is chosen, why he is so special. And so she grants him powers that normal people would not have. And those powers can basically be summarized in wings and arrows. Okay. Now, the wings are, as listeners may imagine, he gets wings to where he can fly at very, very fast speeds to where people can't even see him. And so there is this sense of freedom that at least initially brings him happiness. And she grants him these powers because they will bring him happiness, at least both of them think at first. But she also can grant him the power of arrows. And what these are, I guess, pyramidal type arrows that he can cast at people. And they're 2 color of arrows. They're red arrows, which is what he's first introduced to, and then white arrows. Now, the red arrows, he can shoot into individuals, and it will make that person love him. Both in terms of romantic love and also just devotion, doing what you say. But they're also, he learns later, white arrows. And white arrows, when fired at someone, kill them instantly, but they die happy. Okay. So she grants him these powers, and Mirai, it turns out he has a love interest. He is taken by a fellow student named Saki, and so Nase wonders if maybe Mirai will want to use the red arrow on Saki. But, we should mention here that Mirai is a very principled young man. He wants Saki's love, but he wants to earn it the old-fashioned way. And so that's the setup that we have. Now, as the first volume progresses, we learn that the reason that Nase has come to the rescue of Mirai is that he is one of 13 candidates that will eventually replace the current god in about 999 days or something like that. And but then they witness something on television where someone, a comedian, and he goes by the name of Rodriguez. But the way that he's drawn here, I couldn't help but think of Adam Sandler because he's a real jerk. And the news report is that all of these women are falling in love in a very unnatural way with this comedian who didn't seem to have a history with women in the past. So that's unusual. And both Mirai and his guardian angel, Nase, think that, perhaps he is one of these angel or one of the ones saved by an angel. And they actually do see an angel with him. And in fact, we should mention that only one of the 13, along with their guardian angels, can actually see the other angels. So someone could have a guardian angel, but if you're not one of the select 13, then you can't know that, right? Because you can't see their angel and you can't see the arrows or the wings. So, the common Joe or Josephine wouldn't know what's going on. They wouldn't know that they have a guardian angel, they have the ability to fly and shoot these arrows out of their hands. So anyway, this comedian Rodriguez is using his powers in a very selfish manner, and he is soon killed by someone who is wearing this like superhero uniform. He looks like a Power Ranger. That's what I thought. And he's going by the name of Metropoliman. And, it's the name Metropoliman that kind of added to the potential hokiness as I was first reading this. I go, okay, wait a minute now. What is this? What is this I'm reading here? I don't know. I grew to appreciate better, the whole idea of Metropoliman and what this character whose name, I don't think we get it in the first 2 volumes unless I missed it. His name is, Kanade, Uruyu. But I read that I think somewhere else. I didn't find it in the books. But this guy apparently has all those powers of both the wings and the red arrows and the white arrows. And as one of the 13, he is determined to kill off the other 12 in order to become the new god.
Yeah, it's like I said, I was actually rereading some of this last night after I watched Death Note, and I was really struck by the similarities in the kind of themes that were being explored in Death Note as well as this kind of idealism and justice and stuff like that. And obviously there's strong components of like death and the supernatural and stuff like that. But it's like you said, it does sound kind of like a kind of hokey when you're describing it. It seems as though it has a bit of a hokey premise.
But when you step back, and especially as you mentioned, compare it to something like Death Note, you do start to see kind of a larger picture here, that we have this larger battle of good over evil and innocence versus experience and what that might mean, sticking up for your principles. So there's some larger issues going on here. In other words, we have almost a theological narrative going on in Platinum End, even with just 2 volumes out in English so far, which is the same thing I thought about Death Note, right? That there's something theological going on there.
That's interesting. I wasn't thinking it was, obviously there are like theological and kind of vaguely religious elements going on when you have angels and gods and stuff like that in Platinum End. But I was really struck more by this kind of conflict between idealism and principles, and even like you mentioned, Mirai is a very principled young man. And I was really I understood it more as a kind of interrogation of those idealistic tendencies and principled tendencies. But I can see the kind of religious aspects that you're referring to as well.
Yeah, and I don't want to go too far with this, but I was wondering about the significance of the 13 candidates because, we have the one who's attempting to gain the Godhead, so to speak, so that just leaves 12. And, 12 is a rather significant biblical number. Yeah,
and I am also interested in, and I would not be the person to know the significance of this, but there seems to be some significance of 999 days. And so I'm sure there is kind of aspect to it with the numerology that I'm not able to pick up on.
And of course, 999 is an inversion of 666.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you mentioned, we also have angels. And it's interesting in that there's a hierarchy of angels, at least in terms of the powers that they possess. So what we've learned so far by the second volume, and who knows, there may be more to this and maybe more granular as we get into future volumes, there are basically three classes of angels. There are, I guess, special class angels, and that's the top, right? And so they're the ones who show, I guess, the highest ability, usually the more innocent, who can grant all the powers, right? The wings, the red arrows, and the white arrows. Then there are first rank angels, which can grant maybe one or two powers, and then second rank angels that grant not the same number of powers or the same strength of powers. So there is a caste system, so to speak, within angeldom. And, there are also some interesting things going on here with the way that Obata distinguishes the angels. Now, the two main angels that we get in volumes 1 and 2 of Platinum End, there is the aforementioned Nase, who is the guardian angel of Mirai, and there's also, especially we get in the second volume, the guardian angel Lapel, who is the guardian angel of Mirai's love interest, Saki, who it turns out, is one of the 13. Curiously enough. And both of them are fairly innocent, Nase much more so than Lapel. Lapel is a little more conniving, but not necessarily in a negative way. She is more controlling and less innocent. But we do see a few times the guardian angel of Kanade, who is Metropoliman. And one of the things that struck me about the different way that Kanade looked as opposed to, let's say, Nase or Lapel, is she was much, much more sexualized. In other words, with Nase and Lapel, you do get to see some of their curves, I guess the angel curves, but it's nothing too pronounced. But when we see, and, albeit at a distance, but we do see this, Kanade's guardian angel, she is quite voluptuous.
Yeah, there is, and they do mention that, my angel's much more sexy than your angel, which strikes me as a bit odd, but Nase's kind of childlikeness is, I think they say that to be a special class angel, you have to have just any quality in abundance, and hers is a kind of childlikeness or a naivete or an innocence. So there is a kind of point to the kind of physicality and the so-called attractiveness of the various angels, but right. I'm not really sure what that point is yet or how necessary that point is.
Now, this didn't come out in the first two volumes that we're discussing, but I did a little investigation, and Metropoliman's guardian angel is named Misa, but she's also known as the Angel of Lust. Mm-hmm. So I think that should explain a few things, whereas Lapel is referred to as the Angel of Emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would be interested to read on and see how that kind of the significance of those nicknames or titles, because like you said, it's mentioned throughout these first two volumes, but it's unclear if there's really a point to the kind of sexualization of these non-sexed figures. Mm-hmm. And that's odd.
Right. Well, think of it though. Misa, the guardian angel of Kanade, Metropoliman, I mean, this guy has primarily so far been defined by violence, by aggression, by greed. And if his guardian angel is known as the angel of lust, right, and she's more sexualized than the other ones, then these are not necessarily positive traits. Especially for angels. And so it would make sense to me that the violent, greedy, very selfish Kanade would have a guardian angel who is, I guess, the equivalence of that in angeldom.
Yeah, I think that's a fair kind of connection between the two. But I would, like I said, the we see a kind of sex scene or an orgy scene in the first volume with this character of Rodriguez, and
Japanese Adam Sandler.
Yes, and so there's there are definitely sexual elements to the book, and they are fairly they're fairly explicit. But then you look at the way that Obata draws the angels, and they are very kind of explicitly and, to my mind, intentionally non-sexed. They are kind of genderless in a way, and so I would be curious to see more of I'd be curious to read more and think more about these characters that they have no kind of like sexual component to their bodies, but they are sexualized because I mean we are to read these angels as women. I think we are to kind of read them as femme and as female, but they actually have no, they're non-sex bodies. And I think that's an interesting kind of space, like we talked about Ghost in the Shell last week, or last month. The character of Motoko Kusanagi is an ostensibly female character in a non-sexed body, which is a really interesting kind of discursive body to talk about gender and gender performance and gender expression through. So I would be interested to see what kind of Oba and Obata do with those, how they interrogate those bodies, because I think it could be very, very interesting in a way that it probably will not be. But that's a really interesting component that I hadn't really thought too much about until you started mentioning how they are there's a hierarchy of like sexualization going on with these angels.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned that some of the guardian angels like Nase and Lapel are, if not non-sexualized, then maybe more gender neutral. I don't really think that that's the case, because there are many instances in these first two volumes of Platinum End where Nase is definitely shown to have a female body. In other words, you can see some contours of the breast, larger hips. In other words, there are those physical aspects that would make her, to men desirable. In other words, physical markings of a female, but they're not near as pronounced as we find with Kanade's guardian angel, Misa. And so I think it's just a matter of degree. I mean, I never doubted that the guardian angels were female because of the way that they're drawn, and not just their bodies, but their mannerisms, the eyes you mentioned, the moe look, and the way that they react to the human genders, right? So the way that Nase interacts with Miare is different in many ways than the way that Lapel interacts with Saki. So, I see the angels, the ones that we've seen so far, as more feminine, but it's just, I guess, in terms of the sexualization with some of them, a matter of degree. But I think that there's a purpose behind the sexualization of Misa.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're absolutely right that they are drawn to be kind of female figures, and I think they use gendered pronouns. But I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about the need to draw them as women or as female, or to have have these kind of anatomical signifiers of femaleness, or feminists or refer to themselves as women with bodies that aren't. They are in no way sexual, right? They have breasts, but they don't have nipples. They don't have vaginas. They cannot engage. They don't have the anatomical components to engage in sex in any way. And yet they have a gender, right, so to speak. They have these kind of they have a gendered expression. To kind of refer to Judith Butler, they perform a certain gender. Much in the way that I use the example of Motoko Kusanagi from Ghost in the Shell. Her character is understood to be a woman. Others refer to her as a woman. She has a kind of female body or a femme body, but she has a non-sexed body, right? When you talk about gender and you try to biologically essentialize it, you say men have penises and women have vaginas. So what is I think there's something worth interrogating there, where you have a character that doesn't have their body has no sexual component at all, and yet they still have a sort of gender expression. So I didn't mean to say that there's a kind of gender neutral. They have a gender neutral body, or that they are they have no gender, but they have a non-sexed body, and yet they have a gender, right? They lack the thing that we tend to point to as a kind of the ultimate signifier of a gender. They lack that completely, and yet they have a gender.
Right.
So I think there is something there worth kind of. I don't think it's intentional on the part of Sugumi or Obata, but I think it is relevant. I think it's in the text, and it's an interesting component of it worth kind of interrogating.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I do think that though that there's more to sexualization of gendered bodies than penises and vaginas. There's a lot more going on there. It's just, I mean, those aren't the only games in town, so to speak. And I think that if this were another kind of series, and if Obata were drawing this in another way, then those issues would resonate more with me. But the way I see it is that Obata has made a conscious decision to represent these angels as female, and not only the way that he draws them, but as you mentioned, how they're referenced, the way that they speak. And I don't think he's trying to mask or androgynize them in any way. Maybe for another author, that would be part of what they were trying to do with their title. But I don't think that that's what's going on here, at least yet, with Platinum End. So there's a part of me that doesn't want to read that into Platinum End, what we've been discussing, the general neutral or the problemizing of gender in angel figures, because I don't think that that's part of what Platinum End has done so far.
Yeah, like I said, I'd be interested to see how the story develops and how they continue to treat those characters and the kind of sexualization of those bodies. I unlike you, I do think there is a kind of probably unwitting kind of problematization of gender in the text, but I would be interested to see how they kind of develop that and how that continues to play out as the story develops, because I think we need to spend more time thinking about it to really kind of properly articulate really what I'm getting at, or what about the text represents what kind of piques my interest. But I do think it could go a number of different ways, and they could kind of tease it out a number of different ways, which I would be interested to see. And I actually, we talk about every episode if we would continue to read this, and I certainly would, and that would be one of the things I would kind of look for, that the way it kind of constructs the gender of those angels, because I do think there is something interesting. I'm not quite sure what is going on, but I think there's something interesting going on there.
Okay. Yeah. I'm with you in wanting to keep up with this series, and so I'm definitely on board for the next volume, which comes out in August. If for no other reason, I mean, for the reasons you mentioned, right? Because I do want to see how Oba and Obata play out this issue, if indeed they do, of gender, especially as it applies to the angels. But the way that the second volume ended, here we are with Mirai and Saki, and they're wondering what to do next, right? Because it seems as if the guy who's Metropoliman, after that big scene at the stadium, which I want to mention in a moment, that they're going to be powerless against him, that he is a little too powerful and conniving, and they're wondering what to do. And this is not a spoiler, but at the very end, when Saki, Mirai, and their guardian angels are wondering what to do next, there's a knock at the door, and someone is there and says, he's one of the chosen as well, and he has an idea, and he needs their help. And he can help them, and that's where things end. And so they're really good, Tsugumi Oba and Takashi Obata, with cliffhangers, because Volume 1 ended with a cliffhanger where Saki first shows up, and we see that she's not the way that we thought she would be from everything we'd heard previously. So, I really like what they're doing there. I did want to talk a little bit about that stadium scene, though. I don't know if you had anything to say about the ending of Volume 2, though.
No, I was just going to say that, I think it's, we mentioned that describing the plot of Platinum End, it sounds kind of hokey, but I think Oba does a really good job of writing. He writes this pulpy sort of story very well, and he makes this kind of hokey or goofy concept really engaging in a way that a lot of action or adventure comics could really learn from.
Right. And I like Oba's style as well, but I do have to say, coming back to the stadium scene, which is in the second volume, that was the one part of this series so far that I don't want to say it frustrated me, but it didn't interest me as much as the other parts, because I thought that at that point the narrative got a little bogged down, not in terms of action, because there's a lot of action that's going on, but in terms of comprehensibility. And I think that that's to some degree purposeful, because what happens at the stadium, and basically in this scene, Metropoliman is inviting the other 11 to meet him there to have a dialogue. Now, what he means by the other 11, he's on television. He says, there are 11 of you out there, and I want to talk with you. He's talking about the other 11 candidates. Now, the 12th, in addition to himself, he's already killed. That was Rodriguez, right? The Adam Sandler-ish failed comedian. But he wants to meet with the 11. And it's at this stadium that he sets up this elaborate ruse, and there are so many twists and turns and levels of obfuscation that are going on here that it confuses everyone in attendance, and two of the people who are in attendance are Mirai and Saki. But also as a reader being in attendance, I was confused as to what was going on. And so at first I tried to keep up. Then when the levels of obfuscation intentionally became too convoluted, I just quit trying to figure things out and say, okay, I'll just continue reading and go along with the ride. But that was the one part of the narrative that didn't engage me as much. But other than that, I really did enjoy Oba's writing style.
Yeah, that is both the scene that I did want to mention, and the way I would have described it as well. I was planning on using the word incomprehensible as well. So our feelings about that scene are pretty in sync. And with you, I think that scene kind of, it goes on far too long, and it grinds the tension to a total halt. And it is, because you have 4 or 5 characters who it's not just that you have backstabbing and triple crossing and quadruple crossing, and then more people show up and they get double crossed. It's that they show up in these Metropoliman costumes as well, and they're drawn so similarly to each other, and there's no color to differentiate them. And there's just so many figures that look so similarly, and they're all kind of there's so much infighting that it does become very, very difficult to follow. Okay, who is this person? What's their relationship with these other people? Like, it becomes very difficult to tell characters apart, and that that really kind of undoes and deflates the tension of the backstabbing and the double crossing, because you never met these characters before, and you're not really sure who they are, and it turns out they're not even who they said they were, and I was really frustrated by that scene as well. A lot of the confusion in that scene was intentional, but I do think they overplayed their hand maybe a little bit too much, and it just became infuriating, because it was so all of these kind of reveals were so integral to the drama, and it became really difficult to really follow and therefore to care about any of that stuff. But other than that, like you, I found Oba's writing and Obata's art really, really engaging and compelling in a way that I came into Platinum End with no expectations. I didn't know what it was about, but I was really pleasantly surprised by how much I ended up enjoying it. And like you, when I got to the end of the first volume, I was really excited to read the next one.
So there you go. Two books that Shea and I have looked at for the month of March. Two very intriguing books. We began with Kazuto Tatsuta's Ichi-F, a worker's graphic memoir of the Fukushima Nuclear Power Plant. And then we followed that with a conversation of the first two volumes of Platinum End, written by Tsugumi Oba with art by Takeshi Obata. And, we should also thank the very good people at both Kodansha Comics and Viz Media for sending us review copies of these books. Most publishers that we work with on this manga series provide us with some kind of copy of the books that we discuss, either hard copy, print, or PDFs. This time around, though, both Kodansha and Viz were very good at making sure that we got what we needed.
Yeah, we always appreciate it when publishers lend us a helping hand like that.
Yeah, that really does go a long way of making our jobs at the Comics Alternative much easier in preparing for the show. And if you want to check out great manga like the kind Shea and I discussed this month, then you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Head on over to dcbservice.com, and there you will find a slew of manga at great prices. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your manga there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want to email us, you can email the both of us at twoguyes@comicsalternative.com. If you want to email me specifically, you can email me at shay@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, what address can they email you at?
Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media, such as on Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and, as we pointed out at the top of the show, YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. So there are a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us.
Yep.
Yes. And so, you can be like Osiris and comment on our monthly manga show via YouTube, or send us an email, or contact us on Twitter, Facebook, or basically any number of means. And we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shay.
We'll see you later.